All right, my friends, let's get this party started. So this is going to be a re-record of the lecture from yesterday because halfway through the class, or about 2/3 through the class, my computer crashed and I lost everything. Bummer. Way it goes sometimes. Just got to roll with it. So let's talk about Schroeder diffusion. So I'm going to try and bang this one out pretty quick because I can trim kind of some of the I don't call it fluff, but I can trim some of the extra stuff off this so we can kind of get through this pretty quickly here. So before we get into the meat of the lecture, I want to hit up on bring up a couple things about the announcements for the rest of the semester. So syllabus is changing a little bit right now because at this point last year, this is when we went into lockdown. Well, just a little bit before this, and things were all kind of crazy. So my syllabus was based off of what was supposed to happen last year, and I don't know, COVID happened and all that stuff got a little crazy. So things are changing up a little bit right now. So what we're going to be doing for the for the roadmap for the rest of the semester is that, this week I'm doing Schroeder diffusion today, which is chapter 14, and then adjustable acoustics for the second half of the week, which is going to be chapter 15. Then we go on a spring break, the crazy late spring break that we're having. And then we come back and we have 2 weeks of school after we get back from spring break. So the way it's going to work after spring break is we're going to have isolation. And so this concept of isolation is a big one in terms of the just overall acoustics, and that's a big one for what we often call soundproofing, and that's just a big deal for a lot of people. So we want to spend some time talking about that, and so that's going to be chapter 16, 17, 18. It sounds like a lot to get through in 1 week, but we're gonna hit the high points on each of those 3 chapters because each one of those 3 chapters is kind of like, oh, I can't even remember what they are right now, but it's basically we can cherry pick the best parts of those things, and then you can go back and get deeper, of course, if you want with that. And then that's going to kind of wrap our main content for the semester. Then the last week of the semester before finals, basically I'm going to talk about acoustics of rooms, which is pretty much, if you look in the book, that's like the remaining like bunch of chapters. It's like the acoustics of control rooms, acoustics of concert halls, acoustics of small recording studios, acoustics of large recording studios. And while I think all that stuff is really important, I think that everything we've been doing up to this part in the semester is the foundation for all of that stuff. So if you decide that you want to go on beyond this course and start building your own gear and building your own, not gear so much, but building your own acoustics and build out spaces for either rehearsal spaces or control rooms or recording studios or concert halls or whatever you want to do, you have all the foundational knowledge from all the stuff we've been going through this semester that you can apply it and then understand how to apply that in the rest of those chapters. So I wish we had enough time to go through all of that, but that stuff I think you can pick up on your own after this class, after this, with your continuing studies. I've mentioned to a few times throughout the semester, this book that most of my classes like that I teach, I don't really use textbooks, but this is like the one exception. And it's just because this book is so stinking good. And I'm hoping that you're actually doing the reading and you're getting something out of it. Because this stuff it will serve you really well as an audio engineer, even if you're not going to be like an acoustician per se. I don't call myself an acoustician. I do a bunch of acoustic stuff, but I don't say I'm an acoustician. But everything from this class and from this book, I apply all the time as a recording engineer, as a mastering engineer, as a loudspeaker designer, as all these different things, all of the different hats I wear in this industry. So I'm hoping that you forge on beyond this course and keep using this stuff and loop through it. If you bought this book, loop through it and read it like when you have some downtime again. It's crazy. Now all the stuff that we've done at the end of the semester, if you go back and reread it again at the beginning of the semester, you're like, from the material from the beginning of the semester, you're like, oh man, this stuff it makes so much more sense. And so I noticed for sure that if you take more than one loop or lap through the book, it really does start to coalesce and become one big body of knowledge. It's pretty cool. Or connect dots. I think that's probably a better term for something like that. So anyway, so yeah, as far as the last week of class, so we're going to talk about the acoustics of rooms. There's not going to be any homework on that one. I just want to talk about it a little bit. And then the last day of class, of actual class, the Thursday of the last day of class, we'll do a final exam review and talk a little bit about that. And then we do have a final exam. It's not going to be a live final exam, but we'll talk more about that coming up. But the final exam, we do a final exam on finals week, but it's going to be just like the midterm. It's going to be available for the entire week of finals, but you don't have to do it during the actual final meeting time. Although that's a good time you could carve out, and that'd be a great time to do it. But we'll talk about that later after spring break. So, all right, let's get into it. So let's talk about this idea of Schroeder diffusion. So we're gonna talk a little bit about this Schroeder diffusion. I just wrote this list up here. This is actually not the most comprehensive list, but we're gonna get into this notion of what we call Schroeder diffusion. And what we're gonna, I guess, talk about. Already talked about this diffusion. I won't say at great length, but we've talked about diffusion a fair amount so far in this course. And because as somebody who's working in a critical listening space, you have essentially what I say is like two main tools for as an acoustician. You have diffusion and absorption. So when you walk into a space and you're like, okay, I need to do something with this room. Like whether you get a call from somebody else or you're designing your own, I don't know, like say like a listening room or home theater or a control room or a recording space or a concert hall or something like that. That you walk into a room, if it's a blank warehouse and you're doing a build out, that's you have to do a bunch of different design considerations. But if you're already walking into a space that's already built and you know, okay, how do I improve the sound of this space? And remember, like I've said this a number of times that rooms don't make sound, right? They don't make any sound themselves. They're passive, but they do react and they interact with sound. And so when you want to tune a room, you have to understand how the mechanics of that space work. And so you essentially you have two different tools at your disposal, absorption and diffusion. So if it's too live, you deaden it down, and it is particular, you can deaden it down in particular targeted frequencies to make it tune the room, like maybe absorb those low frequencies to make it a little bit brighter sounding or more neutral sounding, or absorb those high frequencies if they're giving too much flutter or that kind of thing. And then we have diffusion, where you want to keep the energy in the room, but you want to spread it around. And so we talked about things like using uh, like polycylindrical diffusion or some other just like materials that can diffuse this. But there's this one particular kind of diffuser that we're going to look at right here, and of course it's on screen. That's like a special kind of diffusion, and they're called Schroeder diffusers, but nobody really calls them that. Like they're just called diffusers. They're well, yeah, let's get into it. So, but you've probably all, if you've ever looked at any pictures or been in any of these studios, you'll oftentimes see these kind of devices in the pictures. And yes, while they do look really cool, they also perform a specific kind of function. So let's talk about the Schroeder diffuser and how basically it started up. And so this like. Oh yeah, so you'll hear the term called QRD, quadratic residue diffuser. That's the term that we'll usually use more often. You don't usually call them Schroeder diffusers, you call them QRD diffusers or quadratic residue diffusers. That's going to be by far the most common way we do it. But so it uses a series of well depths and constant well widths separated by thin dividers. So the relative well depths, and so these are, I guess what I'm getting at is these are specifically built for diffusion. And so they have relative well depth is calculated by a number of sequence algorithm. We'll talk a little bit about that here coming up. And then can have a repeating period. What I mean by can have a repeating period, this, like looking at this picture right here, this is one period. So it's like one repetition of this sequence that's going on there. So have a repeating period. So what we want to do, our goal here is we want to take energy in the room and we want to spread it so that it's around. So basically it's diffuse. And there's a lot of reasons for that diffusion. We're not going to go heavy into that because we've talked about it already in this course. But the idea of diffusion is that we want to spread the energy around in the room. And that creates there's a lot of advantages that we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But for this diffusers to work, we need to come up with, like, kind of one of our goals is we want to have this thing work across a broad frequency range. So as kind of like the underlying theme of this course is that it's never just like spreading the energy around the room or spreading the sound around the room. It's like everything is frequency dependent. So one of the things that challenges with any kind of diffusion or absorption or any of this is making things that work over a broad range, or if you want to target a specific narrow set of frequency ranges. So generally speaking, though, for diffusion, we want a broad bandwidth diffusion. So we're trying to make something that's very broad bandwidth here. So generally what this is going to work is the maximum frequency. So the high frequency that these things are going to work at is determined by the well width. So how wide are these wells right here? And then the minimum frequency is going to be determined by the well depth. So the deeper I can make it, the better it's going to work at lower frequencies, and the narrower I'm going to make it, the better it's going to work for higher frequencies. We're going to repeat that a number of times throughout today, but that's just the idea is that the narrower it works, the better in the high frequency range, and the deeper it is, the better at the low frequency range. So that's kind of the start of what our goals are. So let's go back though and talk about how these things started out. And so this started out with this, like we call experimentation as kind of the subheader in the book. And this was developed by Schroeder, and I can't remember his full name, but So Schroeder is this physicist, and he basically comes up with this idea. They're like, well, it's called diffraction grating, and um, it's basically where when a sound or well when a wave hits a surface, the way it reflects can be controlled by these these gratings, these systems. And I'm not going to go into any of the math on this because I don't understand math at all on this, and there is no really math that we're really going to talk about here. But the important thing to understand from this is that basically Schroeder envisioned this idea of this sequence right here. It's called MLS, maximum length sequence right here, that can be used to create a pseudo-random noise by application of plus ones and minus ones right here. So this is like the plus ones and minus ones right here. And what he discovered, not discovered, but derived, I guess you could say discovered, but he figured this out, and he did this with microwaves at first. But basically he determined that the well width is right here. It's going to be a half of a wavelength. So if I took like something, let's say 1 kilohertz, for example, and 1 kilohertz has a wavelength of 34, wait, see, be 70.2, yeah, 34.4, 344, yeah. So 34, 34 centimeters long. So this is like 1 kilohertz right here. So a half of a wavelength would be right there. So that's going to be one of the half of a wavelength for one of these well widths right here. So every plus or minus, so it goes plus or minus, plus, plus, minus, plus. So every time you see one of these, and this is the MLS sequence right down here, that it's pseudo-random noise here, but it's a specific way that it's done. And each one of these widths is going to be a half of a wavelength, and each of the well depths is going to be a quarter of a wavelength. So it'd be 344 or 34.4 centimeters divided by 4, which I can't do off the top of my head. But what this does is it creates a specific way that when the sound hits this, that there's a time delay and a reflection in such a way that it creates this interference pattern that when it hits it at any angle really, but when it hits it, it sets the energy out in different directions I won't say like magical, but it's a very clever way of doing this. So it creates this, but it's this idea that it creates massively wide diffusion over like a wide angle, but it's a narrow frequency though. So here's what like kind of like it looks like. So the incident sound comes on this thing right here, and when it comes down here, and this is a polar plot of showing the energy magnitude in different directions. So I don't know, I believe these are probably 10 dB. So this shows you like this going all the way out here. Well, I guess it's relative. So the sound comes in here and it bounces back, and you can see it sends it this direction, and all these different directions right here. So it's spreading the energy around in there. So this is when it's quarter wavelength deep. And if by experimentation they decided, okay, well, let's move this down to half a wavelength deep. When I do it down here, we see that it reflects almost directly back, and very little energy is distributed to the sides. So most of the energy is reflected straight back. So this is with that diffraction gradient thing. It's just awesome, and just the way how well it works right there. So this is like the experimental verification of how this thing was developed. So let's talk about like so that was kind of the start of it. So let's start like the different kind of diffuser types of this, and then we'll talk about 3 different main types of this. So there's like the first one is going to call the reflection phase grading diffusers. This is what we were just talking about. So I was using diffraction, but I meant diffusers. Like phase grading diffusers here. So this is a Schroeder diffuser equals phase grading diffuser. So it's superior to many other sound diffusers, but it has its limitations. Tend to be very narrow bandwidth. So if you recall when I was talking about that a couple like slides ago, what I was saying is that it's looking at this in terms of wavelength. And so it was specifically targeting one particular frequency. And in the case of that. So as an example here, so this is the example I just gave. So it's an MLS of 15. So that's that math that I'm not going to go into. I don't know. I don't understand it. It's just called maximum length sequence, the pseudo-random maximum length sequence stuff. You'll see it show up everywhere, like in Roomy Q Wizard and stuff every once in a while. But it determines the number of wells and peaks and valleys, I guess, so to speak. And so we design this with 1 kilohertz, like I was just saying. Excuse me. Yeah, snuck up on me there. And so here, because I took this from the book, this is done in inches. Blech, hate inches. Should be done in centimeters, but whatever. We'll work in inches. So half a wavelength groove width is going to be 7.8 inches, or what I said is like going to be 17.2 centimeters. So 7.8 inches equals 17.2 centimeters. No, I didn't do that math in my head, but I just know that half a wavelength of 34. I know half of a wavelength. The wavelength is 34.4 centimeters. Half of that 17.2. So 17.2 centimeters, and then it must equal 7.8. The quarter wavelength is 3.9 inches deep. So for an MLS of 15, the single period be 5 feet wide. So this thing is pretty stinking 5 feet wide, and it tends to be only effective from 700 hertz to 1400 hertz. That's a fairly narrow range. And while that works, that's cool for that range. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just like we want it to work over a wider range here. So the next one we're going to look at here, this is by far the most common one, this QRD, quadratic residue diffusers here. So this was also developed by Schroeder, and it combines multiple, so that other one only had a fixed well depth. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have variable well depths here. And so this is just the kind of basic equation, so to speak. Well depth proportionality factor equals n squared modulo p. So we're not going to go into the math on that. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't really, like, if you want to get into it, cool. But so for n is greater than or equals 0, and then p is a prime number. So maximum well depth is determined by the longest wavelength to be diffused, and the well width is about half the shortest wavelength to be scattered here. So that kind of gives us parameters here, how this thing works. I didn't quite tell what the well width should be. It says it's determined by the longest wavelength to be diffused. Yeah, I guess I didn't say how deep it should be. But the well width is about half the shortest wavelength to be scattered. And there's calculators online that you can use to figure this stuff out. But the big part of this is, like, all this is all well and fine, but what we really care about is this. This is basically the plot that's shown in the book. And so what we see here, so these are the quadratic residue sequences here. So this is our n, which is our count, the well number, so to speak. And then this is the prime number series here. So it goes 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. And if we look at this, so basically, let's take an example. Let's just like the P11 right here. So we would say or the QRD 11. Sometimes you'll see it shown up as. And what that says is that it essentially goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so because it's symmetric, it's repeating back to itself on this here. So we see that it goes, so 0. So that's going from over here. So it goes, so this one is like the end number, the index position, so to speak. And so it's not very zoomed in right here, but it goes, this is the depth. So it's the depth of 0. So these are all ratios. So depending on how deep you want this thing to go, if you want to go really deep, the maximum one would be here like a depth of 9, right? So the depth of 9, it goes all the way to the bottom here. So that would be the 9 times whatever the greatest value is. So these are all ratios. So we'll just say that, say if I want to do something that was 100 centimeters as the maximum well depth, or 100 centimeters. So I would basically find the ratio relative to 100 centimeters off of this right here. So it'd be 9 times 0 is 0. 9 times 1 is, well, I guess it'd be divided by, not times. 1 divided by 9 would tell you how deep this one is supposed to be. But basically, you can see this is a depth. We'll normalize this to 9. So this goes 0. This goes 1 deep. Then it goes 4 deep. Then it goes 9 deep. Then it goes back up to 5. Then it does 2 threes. Then it goes back down to 5, and it repeats the pattern in a palindrome, so to speak. Or is that not palindrome? Is that what it goes forwards and backwards? I think that is it. And it's the same direction, forwards and backwards. That they're symmetric, so to speak. And so so you can see that the depth of this is right here. So this is an 11. And so you can argue that the higher the P here, the more effective it's going to be, the better diffraction it's going to be. But the challenge is it's going to be a lot harder to make. So we'll talk a little bit more about building these things at the end of class today. But like the idea is that these give us this right here. And you're not expected to do all the math. There's just all these calculators online for doing this sort of thing. So you can just look this thing up. And so it's a really popular thing to make these things on your own. You can DIY these things quite well, as long as you have something like a decent table saw. You can do it with a circular saw, but it's pretty tough. A table saw where you can do a lot of really clean straight edges, that's really useful. That will really help out with this sort of stuff. But we'll talk more about like the actual products and how you build these things here. But let's talk about what they are, and then we'll talk about the performance, and then we'll talk about how they're made. So the other thing that's important here is that the wells have to have slats between them. And it's kind of hard to see it in my diagram here, but they're dotted lines between each of these wells. So each one of these is a well. And it's important that you have these slats because that's what's going to give it, when the sound comes down here and it hits this, it's going to go down into these wells and reflect out. And then when they reflect out is, and the narrower the wells are, they're essentially going to diffract out, because remember, diffraction, high frequency, like it's basically low frequencies are going to bend. And if I make the wells really narrow, it's going to seem as a point source. And so it's going to actually bend out in bunch of different directions. And so that's kind of the point of, of having narrow wells. And so the narrower the wells, well, I guess like kind of to explain the physics on it, is basically when the sound goes into that well and it reflects out, they're reflecting out at different time delays. And when they come back out, when it reflects out of that well, if it's a narrow well, you can think about it like a sound source. When we're talking about this notion of diffraction, it's like coming through an aperture, that it's going to emanate as a hemisphere. And so it's going to emanate it's going to spread itself out. And the different well depths are going to, I'm a little fuzzy on the physics on how that one works, like why that actually, why the number of different depths works, but it does. And so I'm a little fuzzy on the physics behind it. So, well, not a little, I'm a lot of fuzzy on the physics of how that actually works. So we're just gonna have to take it for face value, but I encourage you to go in and do the physics dig on that if you really feel like it. So here we have like this one period right here. So this is one period, they're showing it right here. And this is one like this. So this is going to be the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So this is this is QRD 17. So that's this one right here. So we can in fact see it. That matches this profile right here, matches this profile right here. And you'll see that it actually goes 0. So the 1 to 1 is what's actually the repeating part, but there's a 0 at the front of this. But if we stack these together, you just end up with a 0 for each period right there. And so they stack together quite nicely right there. And it's important to remember these are recess, or like these are the recess, or like this is the recess from this point here. Let's see. Yeah. So yeah, so if you want to build these are the wells right here. So whoops, I just noticed a typo. Let me change that. That's annoying. Rude. What's rude? That's not how you spell rude. So primitive root diffusers. So that the first one we were just talking about what's called quadratic residue diffusers. So there's another number theory sequence we can do what's called primitive root diffusers. So primitive root diffusers use a different algorithm to do this. And again, this is just the basic description of how this works. So it's not symmetrical like a QRD. And so this is what we call PRD diffusers right here. And you don't see these ones very often. This is just not something that you see. So basically what we're seeing right here is the diffusers, like, and if you look at them, they have a different kind of quality, a look on it. And, to be honest, I've never seen one of these in real life. Like, it's cool theory wise. And actually there's a lot of active research that happens with this stuff that's going on with this diffusion stuff, especially in more esoteric physics regions than say acoustics. But I've never seen something like this. By far, the most you see is the QRD ones. They're everywhere. And it's usually going to be by you can buy them off a shelf, but you can also make them yourselves. So it's just math. So there's no trademark or anything like that. There's no patent on this stuff. So you can just go make your own with the math on this stuff, which is pretty cool. So bottom line here is QRD is where most of the stuff that you're going to see. So if you want to drop the industry lingos, you say QRD diffusers. That's what we're talking about when we talk about those those well ones. The style of diffusion, most of the time what you're going to see out there in the wild is called QRD. But we will see that there are other flavors of stuff out there. So, okay, so let's talk about the performance of these things. So we have 3 main tools for dealing with acoustics. So, and the book says that we have absorption, reflection, and diffusion. I'm under the kind of the thing I say diffusion and absorption. Those are your main tools. You can use reflection, and that is part of one of your acoustic tools. And we will look at some of that here maybe in a little bit. But for the most part, these diffusion and absorption, those are going to be your kind of tools that you have. Reflection is oftentimes like a problem for me, and then I'm trying to cure reflection by adding diffusion. So these two are like intertwined with one another. Actually, all three of them are kind of intertwined. But so let's take a look at this and just understand how to read these sort of plots so we can just understand what's happening here. So if we have acoustic treatment right here, and so this is our incident sound and this is our reflected sound right here. And the like in physics world, that when you draw like these vectors, the length of the arrow determines the magnitude, how like big the reflection is. So we can see here as that it comes in here, it's going to reflect, but it's going to be small arrow, which means not much energy is going to be reflected. So what we've got here on this plot is it would be like as if I had a microphone here and a microphone here. So the direct sound is really loud and big, and then it bounces off of here, and we see the reflected sound a time later. So this is going to be time on the x-axis right here. We call this temporal response, meaning the time response. So this is the time response of it here. So we can see that it reflected in time. There's a delay, and it's much smaller in amplitude because most of the energy had been absorbed, and that means it would probably being turned into heat. That's where that's going. So if we imagine, and this is the polar plot of this, or spatial, they're calling spatial response. The sound is coming here and it's bouncing off of here, and we can see that there's this little lobe of the reflected energy. So you can't really draw the incident energy in here. It's just showing the reflected energy of the spatial response of the reflected energy at 45-degree angle. So at 45-degree angle, just a little bit of a lobe at 45 degrees. The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. That we're seeing this little angle of this little lobe sitting off here. Now, if we did it on a hard surface, just like a hard brick or concrete or painted concrete or whatever, some sort of hard surface, that we see that it comes in and it bounces, and we're getting just about the same. Well, I guess this is like the words are a little bit in the way right there, unless that's the tip. That we're seeing it does absorb, the energy is less because, like, in fact, it looks like, well, if this is 6 dB per between these dotted lines, it's like whatever, 2 or 3 decibels less between these. So it's not really getting absorbed hardly at all. Most of the energy is getting reflected. But we could also say that, well, it's also getting reflected, but it's getting spread out a little bit. So therefore, even though it's coming in, so it's coming in at 45 and reflecting at 45, some of that energy is being spread out in different directions. So therefore, that's likely going to account for our drop in amplitude a little bit at this mic position right here. We could also imagine the mic position right here. So what these dotted lines right here show you the average, like the differences in between, like in terms of gain or amplitude. So from like this, be like every one of these is a 10 dB drop in there. And then if we look at the diffuser here, so we have our QRD diffusion right here. The angle of incidence comes in right here, and it bounces out, and we can see all the arrows going in different directions. So we can see that they're calling this 10 milliseconds. So it's a 10 millisecond. You can derive what the distance is from these, but you'll see that it comes in, it hits that, and then a time later, whatever, it's like 10, 20, 10, that's almost 20 milliseconds later on both of these. We'll say it's like 18 milliseconds later. So that means that from the incident to that one, there's like a 18-foot thing. So that's probably, I don't know, maybe they have like a microphone set up here and there 18 feet apart, or maybe 17 feet apart. So that means from here to here is probably 9 feet or 10 feet between those reflections, like between the mic here and the mic there. So what that's saying there, though, is that it spreads it all around. And there's this little, like, it gets way fatter down here too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up here. But the important thing is looking at right now is when the angle hits this thing, it spreads it out in all different directions. And the cool thing is that it doesn't matter where the angle of incidence. The angle of incidence can be really steep, coming straight on, or anywhere in between, and it's going to spread that energy out, which is awesome. Like if you look at this, you see that like compared to like it's much more round, right? And that means that the energy is being distributed across the plane. So this is a flat surface, so it's like 180 degrees right here. So it's spreading it out in a hemispherical, not hemispherical, but hemiplanar pattern. So it's spreading it around. So that's really good. Now, one thing to notice here, though, is that just kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning of the class, is that when we talk about acoustics, a lot of times we just throw these energy plots here, but we need to talk about them in terms of frequency, because everything tends to have a frequency component to it. Everything is frequency dependent. So fortunately, they gave us a little plot here. So this is one with 43 wells, 1-inch well depth, or 1-inch well width, and 16-inch well depth. So, and what we see here is, so that's 43 wells. So if it's 1.1 inches well width, so this is like 45, we'll say 45, 46, we'll say 4 feet. So 46 inches wide, we can just roughly say 4 feet. So this is a pretty good size width. So this is like, a pretty good size well. That's the period is 43 wells right here. That'd be like 43 wells times 1.1 inches. That means like this thing across here is about 4 feet width though on this thing. And it's 16-inch well depth. And we can see that if I hit this, so we're going to look at it at 250, 500, 1000, 2000, 4000, 8000 hertz. And then this is looking at it straight on. And this is if it coming the angle of incidence at 45-degree angles. So it comes on straight on and bam, it still is pretty strong reflection forward and back at 250 hertz. And then you imagine, because even 250 hertz, if you work it backwards, the wavelength of 250 hertz is pretty good size. It's pretty long. So it's still going to bounce off this thing and reflect back. You see that like the lower frequencies. I mean, because what we talked about before is like with diffusion, if I want like low frequencies, which have large wavelengths, you have to have large things to interact with large wavelengths, and you have to have small things to interact with small wavelengths. So generally speaking, when you have long wavelengths, you need to have big stuff. And so 16 inches depth though is pretty impressive. That's only, like that deep. And it's still able to really pretty effectively diffuse 250 hertz. And even at 45-degree angle, we get some weird lobing, but for the most part, it's spreading that energy out, which is impressive. And then as we go up in octaves here, between 500, 1000, and 2000 on up, we see that even straight on, the energy is spread out like right back, like in different directions. That's amazing. And so we can see that even straight on or from the side, we're getting crazy good diffusion right there. We're spreading the energy around really evenly. So if you put these around the room, you're going to have that energy spread all around the room very effectively. Now I looked in the book and I can't figure out what this light line behind the thing is. I think these plots were taken from a paper or from a study, and it may say what those are, but I couldn't figure out what that is. Or maybe that's relative to a flat surface, like or something. Because if you look at this 45-degree angle, it's showing it's like this bulge going that direction over there. So maybe that's what that is like this is showing the if it were a flat surface versus the diffusion. But man, this stuff is impressive. Like it works really, really, really well. That's a serious diffuser there to build though. So, okay, now here's the interesting thing. So we basically at this point what we said is that these things kick ass and we're trying to prove why. And it has some pretty neat effects. So we talked about it in terms of frequency effects. So the frequency effects is that if you built well, it diffuses a really wide range of frequencies. Like even so we were talking about those first Schroeder diffusers ones were only going to be working within like a very narrow frequency band. These ones work really well. These work over really wide, between 250 hertz all the way up to 8,000 hertz. And this is kind of like our acoustics important range. When we talk about acoustics, and we've seen this before, when we talk about things like absorption coefficients, almost always you're going to see the absorption coefficients giving for these frequencies right here. So, sorry, I got to keep on my clock. Cool. So, but we also we always talk about stuff in terms of frequency, but now let's talk about this in terms of temporal and gain effects of this thing. So if we were to like bounce, so we have our direct sound right here, and this goes back to like this plot right here. This is basically, they basically put this part right over here just so we can see it. If we look at this right here, we have a direct sound and a specular reflection. So this is if I reflect it off a hard surface, and you see that the reflection off a hard surface basically looks almost exactly the same. We still have some of these little tails down here, some reflections down here, like some room reflections here. But what ends up happening is if I take a diffuser right here, like one of those QRD diffusers, and I have the direct sound, and this is the diffuse sound. And what it does is it reduces the gain significantly. This is only like a couple dB of gain right here, but from here down to here, that's like, I won't say quite 10 dB of gain, but maybe 8 decibels of gain drop right there. That's pretty significant, but it's also, it takes, like you'll see the energy build up right here. And it spreads that energy over time. So the result is that even when the sound hits this diffuser and it bounces off in all the different directions, number one, the reflected gain is so much less because that energy is distributed. So you're not getting that hard reflection off that diffuser or whatever off that surface, because that energy is being spread around. The reflected energy is going to be like the direct reflected energy is going to be much less gain. So it's going to have a kind of a quieting effect, but it's not really quieting. It's just spreading the energy around the room. And then also because it's spreading the energy around the room, it's going to have a spread out temporal effect. So temporal means time. So it's going to have a stretched out reverb tail. So the idea is here is it's going to give you a nicer reverb tail, and it's not going to give you any like hard reflections off of any surfaces there. So this is really big deal for things like control rooms or even like performance halls or for recording rooms, like a tracking room. It's going to make stuff sound live but not reflective in there. So it's a really beneficial tool here. So spreading out the energy creates a much lower reflection of gain. So this is like it's again, we keep the energy in the room, we just spread it around the room much more evenly, and it creates this, well, generally speaking, a desirable effect of what we're looking for there. So that's pretty cool. So let's talk about like the applications of this stuff. So it turns out, kind of like springboarding off what I was just talking about, that it's good for almost any situation. I mean, assuming that you're trying to keep the energy in the room. So like it's good for like, large to small spaces. Like I'm trying to think of like a place where you wouldn't want this is where you want to actually like deaden the room down. So you want to really quiet the room down. Like in the room I'm in right now is pretty dead. I like my rooms really dead, but we'll talk about recording studios here in just a little bit. Like I'm in the mastering room. I like my stuff super dead, but like, so for example, a hall, it's going to spread the energy around in the hall. And when we talk about like concert halls, we want the energy to stay in the room. That's like what we tend to like. I mean, not every concert hall is good for every purpose. Like a lot of time, like for classical performances and the choral performances and like concert band performances, we like to have a lot of reverb. Reverb is like the defining characteristic. And so you want to feel like immersed in it. So we like a lot of reverb, so which means we want to keep the energy in the room, but we want to spread it around so that everybody in the room gets the same kind of experience. So having those in concert halls is a really good idea. And it says it can break up low frequency reflections. So what I mean by that is when we look at something like a large concert hall, not want to say just a large, we'll just say a concert hall, but I mean large room. And if I do something with it where the walls are like, let's say, what's a good size? Say the walls are 20 meters apart. 20 meters is what? 60 feet? That's a pretty good size. That's 60 feet apart. So if I wanted to figure out the fundamental resonance of that, the fundamental frequency of the standing wave, F equals V over 2L for the fundamental frequency. So V is 344 divided by 2 times, what did I say, 20? So 344 divided by 40, what is that? 344 by 40. So that means it's 8.6 hertz. That's like the resonant frequency of, we'll call it, I'm going to round down to 8 just to keep it simple so I can do the math in my head. So we'll say it's 8 hertz. That's well below what's called infrasonic. There's no way you can hear that. So the second mode of oscillation is going to be 16 hertz. The third mode of oscillation is going to be 24 hertz. The fourth mode of oscillation is going to be 32 hertz, and then 40 hertz. So as we get to about the fifth or sixth or seventh, those modes kind of die out. But if we're working with a smaller space, those modes are really tight together. And so we could effectively build these build these diffusers to diffuse these really low frequencies so that they don't build up there. But they're going to be much more effective for like the mid-high frequencies for like creating a sense of space. So churches are interesting because it removes a flutter echo while maintaining energy. So churches are an interesting design challenge because, and we're talking like an acoustic church here. Like most modern churches nowadays have electronic enhancement. So basically they can add like a PA, like a microphone and a lectern kind of thing. But there's still a lot of times a music performance blended with a spoken word performance. That's kind of how a lot of churches still run. Again, nowadays we have electronics and whole entire like relatively often very sophisticated recording situations. But we want the spoken word. We want the reverb time to be loud enough so that the person speaking their voice will fill the room with energy so that everyone can hear them, but also die it down quick enough that between syllables, the energy is died down quick enough between syllables that they can actually understand what they're saying. So there's like a real challenge there. But usually when we have music playing, we want a lot of reverb. So there's a kind of a challenge between the two of these here. And so adding this diffusion in here will allow, well, especially if you have like parallel surfaces, some churches have a lot of parallel walls. And so this can help remove some of the flutter echo. We'll talk about flutter here in just a minute, but yeah, I mean, diffusion is like where it allows us to spread the energy around the room while removing the flutter echo. And And then we can also add some absorption there to tune the room to be like the right reverb tail on that thing. Oftentimes it's easier to add more absorption if you're going to have a PA type system, because you can always add reverb back in, fake reverb, synthetic reverb through the PA if you want to add more reverb in there. And also things for like small rooms. When I say small rooms, I mean like control rooms or recording studios or production rooms or listening rooms or home theaters or those kind of things. Because what it does is it spreads the energy around the room, but you don't hear the wall reflections. You don't hear those those sharp reflections that are happening as they're bouncing off the walls. And so it allows them to sound more natural, so neutral, or I guess I said here, invisible of space. So where you want like to make them like an invisible sounding room. So the energy is there, but it's invisible. So let's take a look at some of these like commercial applications of these things. So because I want to take a look at this. So so they have a bunch of different diagrams in the book that go through and talk about this, but I find it easier and cooler to go actually look at their site. So if we go to RPG Acoustics here, so whoops, pulled up over here. So RPG is, I would say, like kind of the reigning champion in terms of the developer of these things. So when you see these built, RPG is huge. They're really expensive, but they make really nice products here. So they make absorption, diffusion, and low frequency type stuff here. So if we look at the first thing we want to look at here is going to be like the mod fuser. All right. So that's kind of your classic one right here. The mod fuser 1D sound diffuser here. So let's see, they've got let's go to the technical data here, acoustical data. This looks interesting. Actually, let's go back and take a look at this, the little slideshow that they show here. So we see them that they're all along the back of the walls here. This is kind of an interesting example. So they've got this auditorium. So they've got them along the audience wall back here. And then I'm guessing these are absorption panels up here with the fabric cover. Then we have reflection. So when we're talking about our three tools that we have, absorption, reflection, and diffusion, they're all incorporated in this hall right here. So the idea is that especially at ear level or just above the audience level, it's spreading the energy around the room very effectively. But up here, they tend to be doing some reflection and some absorption right here. And then back here, we have some reflectors. These essentially, they're like, I won't say polycylindrical diffusers, but they're arched so that when incident sound does hit it, it spreads out the energy. They're not a sharp, angle, sharp curve right there, but it does spread the energy around the room. And if you see that there's also no parallel walls in this space. So the idea is the energy bounces around the room and makes it a good sound. What else we got in here? Undo this, pause again. How do I press play? Okay, so here we see in the back of this control room right here. So they've done it in the back of this control room. They've added these diffusers along the wall here. And you see the slats and the different diffusers. So they've done essentially 2 periods right here. So here's one period. Oh, actually, no, the whole thing is 1 period. So there's one gigantic period across this right here with multiple different depths. And oftentimes for design decisions, what you'll find is in kind of one of the classic ideas for recording studios and control rooms. So when I say what I mean by control room is that in critical listening spaces, oftentimes the classic rule of thumb is you want dead in the front and live in the back. So what that means is absorption in the front wall and diffusion on the back wall. And the idea is that if you have your speakers up front, you don't want to hear those hard reflections off the walls in front of you. The more absorption you have on your front wall and around the front, it's going to give you more localization. It gives you better imaging. So, and I've experienced this a number of times myself. I remember the first time in my first studio, I was in a basement. I had a pretty good sized room, but it was really low ceilings. But I remember I had my speakers up, and I didn't really have much treatment on the walls. And I was still kind of learning about acoustics at that time. So I finally saved up enough money, and I went out and got some Orlex and put them on those acoustic tiles and made all these acoustic tiles, and I spread around. But I remember the day that I put these things up and I was trying to do like a mix. And I remember going, oh my God, all of a sudden, like before it was like the snare drum was over there kind of. And then when I put out all my acoustic treatment, especially in the front of the room, my image goes, and I'm like, whoa, I can like with my mind's ear, I can like say that the snare drum is right there. It's like so crystal clear. So for me, when I put a lot of absorption on the front wall, it allowed my imaging to get really tight. But for a lot of people, that feels too unnatural to add too much absorption. For me, I like a lot of absorption. But that kind of like a lot of people, what they do is they still want to feel enveloped. They want to hear the energy in the room, but they don't want to hear the reflections. So again, the idea here is you put the diffusion on the back and you put the absorption on the front. So you'll see that a lot. So the diffusers, by and large, are going to be most of the time, well, for like a control room where you have speakers as your sound source, are going to be on the back wall. If you're doing a performance system where you have performers in the front, you might want to actually throw the diffusers on a stage so that they're actually up around. I think we might even have some. So here's an example. This is really cool. This is like really pretty. That fairly low ceiling, but I bet you that's an interesting sounding room. It's really pretty too. I think it's really cool looking. But and we see that they have them all in vertical, and we also have them in a horizontal position. We'll talk about that in just a minute here. So that's that same hall that we were looking at. That's that back wall. Really pretty. Cool. Okay, so that's what they have right there. So they call this one the Mod 1 diffuser right here. So there's a bunch of different diffuser systems that they have going on here. Like, what did I do? That was the Mod diffuser. Oh, this is really cool. It's the same stuff, but they made them out of acrylic, so you can actually see through them. So they're like window diffusers. So they're made of a hard surface here. In fact, they must have like those are the Mod diffusers right there, but you can actually see through the diffuser right there. How cool is that? So you can put these on windows. So if you have like a room with you don't want too much outdoor windows because that's going to allow the ambient sound from outside come through. But this is pretty cool. Like, I don't know. Visually it's cool. I bet you that's like stinking expensive, but I think it's pretty neat. The other thing I wanted to look at with those mod diffusers, let's go back to the other one that I was just looking at. This technical data. Let's look at the acoustical data. Oh, I already did it. So let's take a look at how well these things work. So what this is doing is it's giving us a diffusion and a scattering ISO. So scattering, I'm not entirely sure how, there's a thing in the book on that, but I'm not entirely sure. Like, so diffusion, we think about this like a coefficient. So a coefficient meaning perfectly diffuse and perfectly reflected, like a specular reflection. So we can see that that when a sound hits it, it really kicks in around 500. Well, we'll say like 600 hertz, between 500 and 600 hertz. There, it's where it really starts to work well. And again, I'm not entirely clear what the difference between diffusion and scattering is. I have to do some reading about that, but the trend still holds here. That when these things are very effective above 500 hertz at spreading the energy around, below 500 hertz, not so much. But they do have bizarrely, they have an absorption coefficient of around 0.2. And that's probably because of some diaphragmatic action going on there. But I'm not entirely sure why, because these are hardwood systems. I'm not sure why they have an absorption coefficient there. But it does absorb some of the sound. So it shows that it kind of serves a dual purpose of absorption and diffusion. But 0.2 is pretty reflective. I mean, if you remember back to your absorption coefficients, 1 being a perfect absorber, 0 being a perfect reflector, this is pretty close. This is pretty reflective. It does exist, but as a absorber, but for the most part, it's a reflector. But pretty interesting to see there, but pretty effective for these things, for how well they work there. So, it's pretty fascinating stuff right there. They have drawings and stuff. Cool. 2x2, 4x2. So it must be 2x2 feet. A lot of times in acoustics, just in the US, most stuff is done in 2x2s or 2x4 feet or 4 feet by 8 feet. But usually most stuff is going to be 4 foot by 2 foot. Let's just see I just want to see what these are. Cool. So they talk about there. These things are not going to be light because they're a lot of wood, and it's all natural wood there too. You don't have to make them out of natural wood. You can make them out of melamine, or even acrylic. You can make them out of all sorts of different materials. In fact, you can even make them out of styrofoam. If you've been into Studio F on campus, if you've not been to Studio F, you will be like next year. Go in and check out Studio F. On the back of the wall, they have some diffusers there. These ones are the ones on school. They're using styrofoam. Don't stick your pencils into them, please. But they don't actually have the wells, and so they don't have the slats between the wells, and so they're not nearly as effective, but they're a lot easier to make right there. What are the products we have here? So, I don't know. Let's just look at Pyramid Golden. I just want to select one of these and see what they are. I don't even know what's the product. What are we looking at? These things? Oh, those are cool. Yeah. So those are just essentially kind of diffusers. Yeah. Where the sound hits it and it's just going to reflect it in different directions. I don't think these are going to be nearly as effective. Do they even give the technical data? Let's look at does not give you the acoustical information off those. But where are you? Oh, they're just these thin on the ceilings. They're diffusers right there. They're probably a lot less expensive there. I will say that if you're buying something from RPG, they are expensive. Stuff is really expensive right there. We'll come back and look at some more of these here in a little bit, but um, they do make some pretty cool like absorber panels right here. So the classic absorption panel right here. So fiberglass wrapped panels right there. Oh yeah, I'm gonna pause on this one for a second. I did pull this one up yesterday. So these are just like your classic absorption panels right here. So it's probably the Owens Corning 703 that we were talking about, the rigid, semi-rigid fiberglass, and then they're usually wrapped in fancy fabric. The fabric that, by the way, of choice is I don't know if it's Guilford of Maine. I don't know how you spell it. I can't remember. It's been a long time. Guilford. There it is. Guilford of Maine. This is the Guilford of Maine fabrics. This is by and large, if you want to cover your acoustic tiles, this is where this is what most people use right here. This is the fabric that you see. It's called Guilford of Maine, and it's like I said, it's by and large the most used acoustic covering fabric out there. It's really expensive, but at $23 a yard or less, we'll say like it's about between $20 and $30 per yard of this stuff. But it's fire code compliant and it's acoustically transparent. So this is what most people use for this stuff. So that's likely what we're seeing on the wall right here. Is these are Guilford of Maine. They come in lots of different colors and stuff. So this is like an audiophile acoustic listening room. If you don't know what these speakers are here, these are called Wilson audios. These are crazy expensive speakers. I think these are like between $90,000 and $100,000 per speaker. It's seriously, it's crazy. These are wicked expensive speakers. You have a chance if you want to. So coming up next fall and next October, I think it's October. Yeah, there's going to be the Rocky Mountain Audio Fest is coming back to town out at the Gaylord Hotel here in Denver. Well, I guess it's not technically Denver, but out by Denver. It's out by the airport. They basically, you can go into all these different rooms. They got the hotel rooms and turned them into listening rooms. And you can go from room to room and listen to the speakers. And they usually have a Wilson Audio. It tends to have a pretty good showing. So I encourage you to go listen to these speakers and say, are they worth it? But these are amps. So these are the amplifiers, which are ridiculously expensive as well. And then, of course, here's all the component stuff. But what they've done is they've done a ton of absorption in this room. And I bet you that's a badass sounding room. That'd be awesome to listen to music in that space. Do they have any other ones in here? Okay, so they're just doing some mod diffusers plus the absorption panels in 2 foot by 2 foot. So that's a pretty interesting way of doing that right there as well. So it's pretty cool. Like RPG is an interesting company to go look at all their stuff that they've got. We'll look at some other ones here in just a little bit, like just on Sweetwater, where like if you want to buy some more of these, how do you actually get into this stuff? So all right, let's get back to our presentation though here. So we'll keep going back to RPG here in a minute, and because I want to pull up some of their other products to look at here. But one of the things that's interesting to note about these is that when we talk about these diffusers, like so if we look at these are the wells right here, that it's a one-dimensional diffuser, so that the sound, if the sound coming in on it is going to spread it around in one dimension. So I guess you could say it's spreading around in 2 dimensions, but essentially it's a planar thing. So it's a one-dimensional to get. Well, the way it's reflected, it's in one axis there. So the problem is if I have sound coming in from the top, it's just going to reflect down. It's going to diffuse it, but it's going to diffuse it down. So what we want to do is if we want to get the best effect out of this, we need to rotate them both 90 degrees in 2 different axes right there. And so we saw some of those pictures when we were looking at this, like in this case right here. So this is going to diffuse in the horizontal plane, and this is going to diffuse in the vertical plane. So you want to use a combination of the 2 of these. And we saw one also in that other, like I think it was in the mod diffuser right there, like this one right here. So you can kind of see that they've got different axes. These are all done in one axis. So they're going to spread it around in the flat plane, but they aren't going to diffuse it up and down. Whereas if I turn them sideways, that's going to diffuse the energy up and down as well. So you need to do a combination of the 2 to be most effective with these, and you'll see different ones with that. So this other thing we have the flutter echo. So we've talked about the flutter echo way back in the day, and so what flutter echo is when you have 2 parallel walls and it's an echo, and if you have a little bit further space, like a larger space, the time delay between those echoes is long. If it gets between 30 and 50 milliseconds or greater, those echoes become discrete, and they don't like it's past the Haas effect window. Where your ear hears them at discrete events, and it goes brrr, brrr. I mean, they're awful. You like for recording and even listening, flutter echoes. I can't think of a reason that they're cool. I mean, they're an interesting artifact, but in any kind of situation that you'd actually want a flutter echo in something is bad. So we want to get rid of those things quick as much as possible. And the truth is, like when you're walking to a space, generally speaking, you're not going to have the luxury. Sometimes if you have the luxury of doing an original build out before the space is even built, then you have the luxury of building splayed walls. So that one of the solutions, of course, is building splayed walls. So if they're greater than 5 degrees, then basically the energy won't bounce back and forth in terms of an echo. So the energy will bounce around, and it's gonna get these reflections, these echo reflections, but they're gonna be bouncing around in such a way that they're not going to go back and forth, and so you don't hear that. But by and large, most of the time we build our rooms out of parallel walls, and that's for obvious reasons. It's a natural way of creating the most efficient use of space. And for construction reasons, just having things on at 90-degree angles just makes a lot of sense. But from an acoustic perspective, that's really bad. So if you're going into, say, a space that has that parallel walls, and you need to do something about that, if you can do these things called, well, I think they're called these are called flutter frees. So these flutter frees, this is taken from the RPG site. They're basically just these small versions of diffusers of QRD diffusion right here. And what they do is they diffuse the energy around. Because they're so small, actually I have one right here. Because they're so small, they're going to work pretty well at the high frequencies. They're not going to work very well at the low frequencies, but they do work, again, pretty well at the high frequencies. So I was given this as a sample. It's got a little bit of a bow to it, but really pretty. Hard to make DIY, but this one has actually got holes cut in the back right here, these slits right here. So if I were to lay this over and it's got a groove in the side right here, so you can do like essentially, if you put a tongue in there, you can actually tongue these together so that they become one unit. But what that allows it to do is that for the high frequency, it diffuses, and then at the low frequency, it acts like a Helmholtz resonator. So it's kind of a cool dual purpose. So it absorbs low frequencies and spreads out high frequencies. And for most cases, in like small to medium-sized rooms, that's usually what you want to have happen. Those low frequencies build up those standing waves, and that's when we have problems with that. So this is a great way to get rid of those flutter echoes and yet absorb the low frequencies. So they're really cool. Again, they call them flutter free, but you can make your own versions of these things. If you had a table saw, although I think a CNC would be way easier, you could potentially build these on your own, but they're kind of tough. Like it's a tough one to do there. So, okay. So when I say that's good for high frequencies, well, what if we wanted, like, again, one of our goals is we're shooting for a broad bandwidth. We want to go absorb from low to high frequencies. So we're saying that the width of this, so the width of these grooves right here is going to absorb the high frequencies. So these are going to work really well all the way up to the really high frequencies. But the well depths, these are very shallow, relatively fairly shallow. So the temptation is to make really deep wells if we want to make this thing work over a large range of frequencies. But the problem is, as we start going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, that the sides of these wells, these dividers, they start to act as diaphragms. They become diaphragmatic. So they basically will start to resonate themselves. So that's a problem. So one of the ways, how do we mitigate that? Well, what we can do is we can take the approach that, just like I was talking about before, small things interact with high frequencies, large things interact with low frequencies. Rather than trying to build one size fits all, why don't we build small versions of these for the high frequencies and large versions of these for the low frequencies? And what we're going to do is we're going to apply them in a fractal method. So what we're going to do here is we're going to basically apply a fractal type system here. So they can be 2 or 3 fractal layers deep right here. So this is what we call diffractal by RPG. And we can see that basically they have a small version of it here, and then it's the big version of it on the outside. And in fact, we could actually use this whole thing right here, and we could turn that into, we could stack these, like a bunch of these whole diffractals right here in such a way that those are working with the low frequency. So we can diffract low to high by using not entirely one set of diffusers that are going to work over a broad range. We use a series of versions of these things, and it's cool. Like, I think, let's go take a look at the site on the diffractal site here. I think they show some pretty neat ones right here. So diffractals. Oh yeah, look at this. Look at this place. Man, that's an expensive haul. So they have all the diffusers up on stage right here. So they have a bunch of diffractals on the wall, and they have some more here. We have some. I'm sure these are reflectors right here. So what we usually want to do is we want the energy to come out towards the audience. So that it comes up and it bounces out towards the audience. So they're angled in such a way that they bounce towards the audience, but nothing's parallel in this entire space, right? So everything has these kind of diffusers and absorbers to keep the energy in the room to spread it around. But I think this would be an interesting space to perform on, because on stage, you're not going to get these hard reflections. You're going to get this very diffuse. So it's going to sound energetic, but diffuse. I bet you that's really cool. Yeah, so here's a version of some of the diffractals in a listen. This must be, this is that same space we were looking at before, with the Wilsons on the front. So it's absorbing in the front, just like we were talking about before, absorption on the sides and the front, but then diffusion on the back. And then they have this, they're doing this big kind of, this could be like some sort of like big bass absorber back here, but they also have the diffusers on there. So this is done with a series of, so they're doing a series of diffractals with diffractals. So, let's see what else we got. Yep, so there's some in there, and they turn these ones sideways there. So it's pretty cool. That one's neat. So you can see that they're using diffractals as a fraction. So this is a 3-layered one. So each one of these has like little tiny ones, diffractions inside of each one of these. Then each of this is a whole period. And then this one gigantic thing is a whole period. So it's much, much larger. So we'll talk about this one in just a minute here, this version of this, of what's going on up here in just a minute. But this is fantastic. This is really cool. So you can see the use of these. I think is it like Peter Gabriel Studio, I think is what it is. Let me see. I gotta look at this image. I should have looked this up before. Let's see. There's an image of this studio. It's right here. I want to look at this wall. It's the back wall of his studio. See if I can get a better picture of it. I know it's really neat. Is that it? It's hard to see it. Let me open up this picture. Let's see, open image, new tab. It's hard to see it right here, but these entire wall, so you've got these amazing diffusers up here, but this entire wall here is like 3, maybe 4 layers of diffusers in there, and it's insane. It's just so cool looking. So that diffusion, look at this studio, that's intense. But this is like apparently like that would be an amazing place to hear that. I've never heard something like that. I'd like to be in a space like that. Let's see if I can hear it. Let's see if we get a better picture of it. Yeah, that's not really helpful. Maybe here. You can kind of see him back here. But big fan of that stuff. So I think that's really cool. I think that's a really neat way of doing that. So let's get back into this. Okay. So here's the diffractals continue. Here's just another version of it, so you can see how they're built right there. So what about, like, what we can do is we can, in fact, instead of, so this, like we were talking about, they're basically hemiplanar, so it only works in one plane right there. Well, what if we want to work it in 2 different planes? So it can work in the X and the Y, or like, so basically what they've done is, they being like RPG and these other smart acousticians, came up with the number theory sequence so that it works in both this direction and as well as this direction right here. So that's what we're like the Omni ones that we were just looking at over here in RPG. So that's what we see with the Omni fuser. Like let's go to pull this up a little bit. Products, Omni fuser. So these Omni fusers are these ones right here. So they're basically, so this is absorption, diffraction, or not diffraction, diffusion. So you can see that basically these ones only work in one axis, but these work in 2 different axes. And so they're only giving us 2 pictures on that one, but it is pretty cool. So those are working in 2 different axes. So when the sound hits it, it spreads it out, not in just one plane, but also not just the vertical plane, but also the horizontal plane. So it spreads it out in like a hemispherical position. So that's really cool. But I'm willing to bet that they aren't as effective as this one right here. It works, but it's not as effective. So I think, like we saw, that a combination of the 2 of those would be a pretty solid strategy. So what about diffusing concrete blocks? We've seen before that concrete blocks have the surprising ability to absorb low frequencies, and that's because they're porous. So, but high frequencies, they're really reflective. At low frequencies, they're pretty absorptive. So what if we turn the concrete blocks into this diffuser, like using this QRD diffusion? And so that's what so these are also by RPG. They're called what are they called? Diffuser blocks. So diffuser blocks, you can buy these. They're not really shown. Oh, they're right there in the wall, right there, concrete wall. So this would be really great for like gymnasiums and band rehearsal spaces, like concert, like school rehearsal spaces, because those things are like tough as nails. You will see like, um, yeah, that's an expensive gymnasium. So I don't even know. Like, yeah, they're doing these out of concrete blocks, which is an interesting space. Which that sounds pretty neat. So that one they painted over the concrete. These ones are exposed concrete, so they're going to absorb at low frequencies. But what's interesting is you see these little holes that are right there. Those are little cavities into the back right here, and those are the Helmholtz resonators. So those are also additional low frequency absorption. So again, we're spreading around the high frequencies and we're absorbing the low frequencies through Helmholtz resonators. It's pretty interesting stuff. I'm pretty expensive, I'm sure, but pretty cool. I really like this. So if you were hired by say a high school or someone to come in and design one of their like band rehearsal rooms, this would I think be a very good solution for spreading the energy around, because they're just like they're concrete block. They're not like, if you do fabric or wood or any styrofoam, they're gonna get beat up. Just people run into those walls a lot. So this is a pretty neat solution for that. So let's take a look at a couple things here. So comparison of graphic trading with conventional approaches. So I'm only going to like spend like a minute on this here, but if we look at like, basically this is hard to kind of decipher here, but this is the frequency, this is the angle back here, and then what we see is the amplitude in this direction right here, energy in dB. So what we're seeing, and it's kind of hard to tell on this profile right here, but this is if I have the energy coming straight on and reflecting back, it's going to be very strong. We don't have very much energy on the side, so it's very strongly reflected across the front. And then at 45 degrees, we're seeing that the reflection is very strong. Then if we do a flat with distributed absorption, so this is like, again, if you are called upon to throw absorption up there, you never want to put your absorption in one spot on the wall. You want to pocket it around the wall. It's much more effective if you have a grid pattern or like something like you spread it around. You don't want it to just be in one spot. So, but you see that it works pretty well. It like basically it just absorbs the sound right there across there. So we see a polycylindrical diffuser right here. It does pretty well. And we could see as a function of frequency, it's pretty fixed through the entire frequency. This is only between 1 and 10 kilohertz right there. So it'd be interesting to see a broader frequency range right there. But we see that it does tend to spread kind of the energy around pretty good. And then we see a bicylinder. So bicylinder, so two smaller ones tend to work pretty good at a 45-degree angle. So actually it tends to break up that center peak by having two of these pretty well. But we see that quadratic QRD right here, it's just insane how much energy it spreads around. It just like distributes the energy everywhere. So that's a good thing. So I'm only spend a couple minutes here, but I keep saying it over and over and over that you'll see these things that like the RPG stuff is just over the top expensive. But diffusion is one of the really important tools in your tool bag for treating a room. But there's a lot more than doing it with QRD. So QRD, or like not with just QRD, but with RPG acoustics. RPG, they're pretty much like meant for like super high-end professional stuff. How do we do this as regular people off the street that want to make diffusion in there? And you'll see a lot of stuff out there. So this is the one that you see show up a lot. So look up like DIY acoustic diffusers, and this is like one of the ones that's like they give you essentially it's essentially an inverse. Well, it's not even inverse. It's basically the same one as the omnifuser that you're seeing on RPG, but it doesn't have the slats in this one. So this one is just doing just the pegs, and the pegs do work, but they're not nearly as diffuse as working with the wells. The wells themselves are what really make these things work. I'm not going to say they'll do this. These work, but they're not nearly as good. But let's go take a look what other options there are out there. So if I were to look at, say, let's just go to Sweetwater for a minute here. And let's look up diffusers and see what they've got there. So what's funny is like this is like, so they call them diffusor with an OR, but the book says ER, diffuser with an ER. And so it's just strange. Actually, let's look up diffusion. All right, so this is like another company called Part Science 3-inch space array diffuser, 2 foot by 2 foot. So $600 for two of these, pretty expensive. So what I'm saying here is if you are decent with a table saw and woodworking, you could actually start making these things and custom versions of these in custom sizes You got to advertise and stuff, but like you can do pretty well with this. So I used to use these things. Or like 7-inch T fusers, 3D for 4-pack was $240. Like these things are crazy. Like, come on, open up. They're it is ultra thin plastic. Like these things cost them maybe 50 cents to make each. It looks almost like packaging. So like it's crazy, and they're charging $224 for 4 of these things. They weigh literally like 20 grams. Like they're so it's super thin plastic, but they're diffusers, and they come up with this kind of like diffusers kind of thing. I'm curious what the technical versions of these inconsistently cut panels. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, they're just I've used these before because my friend bought them, and I kind of inherited them, so I used them for a while. But man, those are really expensive. So what we're seeing here is that diffusion is expensive. So there's a lot. Like what do we have here? More diffusers. That's all we're really showing on here. They're not really showing much other diffusion here. So let's do so polycylindrical diffusers are super cheap and easy ones to make. But if you want to start doing these ones, that's one great way to get into this stuff. Let's see so like it's weird because the book says diffuser. Let's see what like we see. Let's look at images here. See what people coming up with. So you'll see that this one, I've seen these kind of ones before. They basically are just a bunch of random stuff up here. They're not mathematically founded, so it's just going to work. It's just going to diffuse sound. It's going to work pretty well, but it's not nearly going to work nearly as well as the slatted one right here. So here's like these ones where they're doing them striped, but they don't have the wells. And again, they will work, but not nearly as well. I've seen this one. This is a fractal based version of one. So here's a fractal. So we see the different protrusion fractals, but again, without the wells. So that one's pretty cool. Quadratic QRD. So GIK acoustics. They make some pretty expensive ones. Actually, GIK acoustics. If you're in Studio F, that's what all the GIK acoustics products are. So these are ones with the wells that are going to be much more effective right there. Ooh, that one's pretty cool looking. So I don't know how effective they were, but looks cool. I mean, pretty neat. So there's a lot of different. Ooh, I've seen these. I like this. This ramp one. I like this because it's a gradient. So I think that's gonna be pretty interesting how that would work. Yeah, I'd like to. I was considering making some of these myself for my back wall here. These ones are interesting. So aluminum acoustic diffusers. So what they do is they come in, but they have these little side wells, and those side wells I also act as like chambers for reflection. And so there's some pretty neat technology with this kind of stuff here. Ooh, this is neat. So the thing is, yeah, when you start building these like this, that even the one I was just showing you, these things like the peg walls, they get so heavy. They're like mounting these on the wall. They are real heavy. Like this kind of stuff is so heavy. But it works. And so the advantages of doing something like these ones is that there are air cavities behind each of the slats. So, but they are a little bit challenging to make. So, cool. So the last one I wanted to show here was, this is called Blackbird Studios. So this is down in Nashville, and I've talked to some people that have worked in these rooms right here. So they've said that the room is so neutral. You can't even, if you close your eyes, you have no sense of space of how big that room is because the reflections are so diffuse that you cannot tell where the walls are. I can't imagine you're like, oh, I need to go plug something in back here, walking around here and snapping one of these off because it snags on your shirt or something like that. But apparently these are all mathematically done. I don't know. Like this is all MDF. So, and they're really deep. So this room is heavy, really heavy. But I've heard, and if you look at pictures, it's called Blackbird Studios. You can go look it up. There's tons of pictures of it, but it's crazy. In different pictures, you see different consoles in here. So I think they switch out. This is an older console right here. This is the old Avid stuff. But actually, those are in D&E. If you've not played in there, we have one of those modules. Actually, this module right here in Studio D, and they work really well. This is just the older version of this thing. So anyway, so I guess kind of the bottom line here is that diffusion should be one of your go-tos for acoustic treatment, but buying diffusion off the shelf is really expensive. So having a little bit of like shop skills will really go a long ways to making your space sound and also look really cool. You can really add some neat design elements to this stuff. So, but if you want to, you can also cover them with fabric if you wanted to hide some of this stuff. But usually, we expect to see that kind of architecture in studios and in critical listening spaces. So, with that kind of wraps it up. There's a few more things that were in the book, like that talk about like how you measure an effective diffusion with the microphone and reflective surface. But we're not really going to go into that. I'll leave that one up to you if you want to go down that road. But other than that, that, my friends, is QR. Well, we call it Schroeder diffusion, but we can also say QRD. Like that's where we see the most of this. But I want you to understand. So when you walk into a space and you see these, you understand what they are. So, all right, my friends, let's wrap there, and I will see you all next class. Cheers.